Okay, Shalom, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, and Yashar Koach for everyone, each one of you that was able to come here on the week before Pesach, and that's I think you get double the credit for coming this year. So we are, Baruch Hashem, we want to end our series about the Rishonim, and we would finish with the Rema. Last week we learned about Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Bet Yosef, who wrote also the Shulchan Aruch, and who is, in a sense, in a way, he is signifying the end of the era of the Rishonim in Sfarad. And he was not born in Sfarad, maybe he was born in Sfarad, but he was deported as a very young boy. And in Ashkenaz, his parallel is the Rema, Rabbi Moshe Iserlish, and we would learn today about him. And again, we speak about Ashkenazic Jews, but when the Rema is born, there are no Ashkenazic Jews in the sense of in Ashkenaz, in what we call today Germany. That was because they were expelled from there as well. So we have to remember that. We speak about Spanish Jewry, but they are not anymore in Spain. We speak about Ashkenazic Jewry, but they are not anymore in Ashkenaz. And that is just the Jewish fate or the Jewish history. So maybe it is better for us. Maybe one day we'll be able just to leave behind this type of definitions, which are not even correct, and only speak about Jews from Israel. But no, that may be a few centuries ahead. So, okay. So we want to speak about Rabbi Moshe Iserlish. And obviously, while we were trying to do a learning about the Rishonim, we only skipped the surface, scratched the surface of the era of the Rishonim. There are many, many extremely important personalities, individuals that we did not speak about for two reasons. A, because there is not enough weeks in the winter to cover all of the great Rishonim. And second, just you can maybe open to me. Thank you. And second, because I did not plan accordingly. In the beginning of the shiurim, if you remember, every personality we did took 2 or 3 shiurim. So I felt very, I was very expensive in the beginning, and I was thinking that we have, the whole life, but no, we had only the winter. So we skipped a few very important Rishonim, but nonetheless, I hope that we at least have some general sense about some of the important Rishonim we had, and not less important, that we maybe have now some type of a structure, historical structure of how from the time of Rashi in Ashkenaz and Rif in Sfarad, how we came now to the Shulchan Aruch in Sfarad and to the Rema in Ashkenaz. Which I think is also very important, not only to know the specific individuals, but also to understand the timeline and how things progressed from one generation to the next. So now we are, just a second. Yeah, now we are learning about the Rema, Rabbi Moshe Iserlish. So some historical background. Some historical background. We have left Ashkenaz in the 30th century when the Rosh, you remember we spoke about the Maharam Rothenburg that was jailed by the German Caesar, excuse me, and we have left Ashkenaz then, and we in our shiur didn't return to them. There were some Jews that remained there, but the majority was either expelled or that they just couldn't live there. The pogroms and the persecutions were just too harsh, and they began the great emigration east. And that is, I think we spoke about that in Ashkenazic Jewry, we see from the 30th century on, we see a constant movement to the east. So from Germany to, let's say, to Central Europe, that is to Hungary, to Austria, and they are moving east, and then to Poland, to Lithuania, to Belarus, and to Russia, and even farther east as time progresses. We can say now that it is, in a sense, it's a movement back towards Eretz Israel, right? So they are moving east and east and east. So in a sense, it's moving back towards Eretz Israel. So they come to Poland, around the mid of the 40th century. All right, so the middle of the 40th century, they are being invited, or at least that's how the stories go. They are being invited by Kazimir, the great Kazimir, or Kazimierz, who was a very important Poland king. Now we have to understand, we speak about Poland, I say it from time to time. We have in our heads the map of 20th century Europe. But when we speak about 30th century or 40th century Europe, that is a completely different place. Many times with just completely different nations. So there are no, let's say, there are no Italians, as we can speak nowadays of Italy. That's completely different kingdoms. There's no France, there is no Germany. So these are very different. Now there is also the modern Poland as we know it is a construct coming out of Second World War. That is not what we speak about when we speak about the 40th century. In the 40th century, we have a great Poland, which is one of the most important forces in Europe, which is not something that you can say about, you can like or dislike modern day Poland, but you'd have to be a very, I guess, adherent of patriotic Polish in order to think that Poland is nowadays one of the most important forces in Europe. But back then, Poland was not only Poland. Poland was Ukraine. It was Lithuania. It was a huge place, and the king was really great. So this Kazimir the Great was really great, and he was inviting the Jews in. Why? Not necessarily because he thought that Judaism is the greatest religion of all. We know that it's correct, but it's not necessarily what he thought. What he wanted is, well, money, as you know, everyone. So he wanted money, and he knew that having Jews in his land is the most assured way to develop international connections. We spoke about that also a lot of times. I mean, back then, there was no international language. Well, nowadays, we would say that English is an international language. It may be that in very recent, it would be Chinese, but at least nowadays, it is English. Now, back then, in an interesting way, Hebrew was an international language. Why? Because Jews from Poland and Jews from Morocco and Jews from Spain could all speak among themselves Hebrew. If you would be a goy from Poland, how exactly are you about to communicate with someone from Morocco? It would be extremely, I mean, Latin would not work for neither of them. So there is no real ability to communicate. Set aside ability to be reliant. How do you know that he would not cheat you? But if you are of the same religion and you are brothers, then there is, I wouldn't say that Jews never cheated one another, but it happens sometimes. But most of the times you can rely on being able to communicate and being able to rely on and have faith with the other side. So that was extremely important, that it made the Jews the best international traders. So that's what was Jews were doing, and many kings or noblemen in Europe of the time understood this importance and invited them in. Many times they also served in another role, which is, I mean, they did it, it was important, but it didn't earn us much fame, and that is either being loaners, credit loaners. Now, we all know that in order for an economy to function well, we need credit. So Jews were able to give loans and take interest. No other could, for the simple reason that the church did not allow Christians to take interest from one another. But if you cannot take interest, then you do not give loans, right? So the outcome of that was that the economy was stuck. In order to be able to have someone that gives loans, you had to invite someone from a different religion. Who was the most available other religion in Europe? Jews. So that was a very important additional role that they played in economy, and another reason to invite them. And last but not least, and again, not something that we had fulfilled, but it was for our great disadventures as history went, and that was we were intermediaries many times between the nobility and the peasants, the serfs, I guess. And that we were able to do so because we were, in a sense, from the UN, right? We were from outer space. So we were not holding favor to one side or the other. That is a little like mercenaries. So the noblemen, which sometimes, let's say the Polish noblemen who controlled Ukrainian Serbs, would invite the Jews to be the intermediaries. So the Jews would implement the policy set by the Polish noblemen on the Ukrainian Serbs, which I would tell you now in secret, but I think you all know, didn't necessarily enjoy the policy of the Polish noblemen. Now, many times the Ukrainians, the simple peasants, they didn't go as far as to blame the Polish nobleman, who many times lived far, far away. So who was to be blamed in their situation? Who was the person in charge? They took the taxes and that implemented, as I said, the policy of the nobleman. It was the Jew. So now that is much later. We are now speaking about the mid of the 40th century, but I just explained how history went on. So what happened was that 200, 300 years later, as these things were developing, and as, again, in Ukraine, it was very, very much emphasized, the Jews were seen as the scapegoat upon which whom you should blame for all the diseases, for all the disasters of society. And when, again, this we speak about in the 70th century, so that is a few centuries later, but when the Ukrainians would stand up with Khmelnytsky, who we say, Imach Shmo v'zichro, but you know that in Ukraine he's being considered as a national hero. There is a city after his name, Khmelnytsky. And when he would revolt against the Ukrainians, then, against the Polish, against the Poles, now it would be much more difficult to fight war against the Poles. It would be much easier to attack the defenseless Jews. That is exactly what we will do. We speak about, some speak about 100,000 Jews that were murdered throughout these pogroms. And we do not speak only about murder, we speak about in the most brutal ways. The Ukrainians were, they did not claim ever to be gentle. With the most brutal way. I'm not going to, you're eating breakfast. There is no reason why to give any graphic details, but it was very, very, very severe. That's something that if you really want to have a bad Tisha B'Av, then read the testimonials, and we have from the time. We have new books that now are being written, and it is horrific. It is horrific. So it was not the end, obviously, of the Jewish settlement in Ukraine and in Poland, but that is part of the graph of history of how it went. But all of that is now in the future. We are now in the 40th century. The Jews are just beginning to come in, and it is heaven. It is heaven. Why? Because this king gives them more or less a free hand. There are no harsh taxes. You are not being taxed for being a Jew. You are being given privileges for being a Jew. So that's beautiful. That's wonderful. No one persecutes you. So the Jews are coming in very fast, and they are having, for a few centuries in a row, they are having baby booms. So there are many babies being, because Baruch Hashem, economy is good, everything is good, you are able to feed your children. So the number of Jews are increasing very, very rapidly, very fast, and they are accumulating wealth and also political influence. Now, in the beginning, as almost everywhere, you do not begin with a rabbi coming in, setting his yeshiva, and then the community grows around him. That is not how things work. Usually the way it works is that the businessmen are the first to come, and then for a century or a century and a half, you have, think about this United States. So in the United States, for 200, I'm exaggerating, but almost 200 is 100 years. I'm not speaking from the foundation of the United States, but from the beginning of the Jews coming in the colonial times. You do not have any rabbi. You have Jews are coming in, but you don't have any rabbi. And Jews are coming in, and we all know what happens when the Jews are coming in to America. Well, these are famous pictures, scenes, that is Jews are coming from Eastern Europe, and they are throwing their tefillin into the sea, in the ship, in the boat. Because, well, Torah was for the old country, and now we are coming to the new world. Even people that did keep their tefillin while coming in, after the first week, when they understood if you do not work on Shabbat, then you are being terminated. And even if you're stubborn enough to take it for first week, second week, you have to feed yourself. If you have children, family, you have to feed your family and children. And Jewish identity was eroding extremely fast. It was much, much, much later that Rabbanim and yeshivot began to come in and to establish themselves in the United States, giving even an option for Jews to return. I mean, obviously, in small numbers, there would always be this one or the other that would be able to cling to a Jewish identity. But in large numbers, it was very difficult before the 20th century. That is just a sad truth. It was very difficult before the 20th century. Even in the 20th century, I mean, now I'm saying something that I'm more hesitant about, but most of the Torah infrastructure that we know nowadays in the United States was only being established after the destruction of the Torah centers in Eastern Europe. And then Rav Aaron Kotler and others are coming to the United States, and they are building much, much, not all, some was already there. So YU obviously was established before, and how that being called, Torah Vadat was before, but much, much, much of what we know today was only after Second World War. Now the same thing, I mean, in defense, same things happen in many, many places. So also in Poland. In the beginning, it's only businessmen, traders. And Poland is known as a rich place, but without much Torah. But as Jews are being persecuted in Ashkenaz, and they're beginning to move east, and yeshivot are beginning to move east, and rabbis are beginning to move east, and also not only persecutions. If there is money, then there would always be someone that would want to build a yeshiva and dedicate it after his parents or after someone else. And so money is there, the opportunity is there. So the Torah begins to move, to migrate from the West, from Germany, from Ashkenaz, from classic Ashkenaz, to the East, to Poland, to what we nowadays call Ukraine, to Belarus, and that would be a process, as I said, that would take centuries. The first Polish important yeshiva was founded in 1492 in Kuzmir, which is nowadays, back then it was a separate city. Nowadays it's part of Krakow or Krakow, and it was established by Rabbi Yaakov Falk. One of the students of Rabbi Yaakov Falk was someone called Rabbi Shalom Shechna. These were extremely important names of yesteryear. Nowadays, I think they are completely forgotten. But back in their days, they were considered as the Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So they were extremely, extremely important back then. Not very much known nowadays. So he was the head of the Rosh Yeshiva of Lublin, not Chachmi, not to be confused with Yeshivat Chachmi Lublin, that we established 400 years later. But back then, what was called Yeshivat Lublin, and he was seen as the Rav Rashi, the chief rabbi of Lublin. So that is Rabbi Shalom Shechna. One of the important students of Rabbi Shalom Shechna, so that it's third generation, right, to the great yeshivot of Polin, would be our hero of today, Rabbi Moshe Iserlish. So Rabbi Moshe Iserlish was born himself in 1530. His father was Israel, so he's Rabbi Moshe Israelish, which would become Iserlish. So that is Rabbi Moshe, that is not a family, that's not a last name, just the name of his father. That is like Rabinovich, or Yakobovich. What is Yaakov? That was the chief rabbi of England before Rabbi Sachs. So what is Yakobovich? It's the son. It's in Russian. When you say the son of Yaakov, it is Yakobovich. And so that is the same thing with the Rema, Rabbi Moshe Iserlish. By the way, sometimes when the mother would be important enough, people would be named after their mothers. So for example, the Maharsha, which would be a generation later. So the Maharsha, Rabbeinu Morenu, Shmuel Eidlish. What is Eidlish? Is Idel, is the son of Idel. So Rabbi, okay. So we have also people being called after their mother, but the Rema was called after his father. So he was born to Rabbi Israel, and to his mother was named Gittel, and it was an extremely rich and important family. He is being sent to Lublin, to the aforementioned yeshiva of Rabbi Shalom Shechna. Is being, obviously everyone understands that he's an Ilui, he's a genius, and in the age of, I guess, ripe age of 13, which was back then considered as the ideal age for marriage, he is being married to Golda, who is the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva. If you are marrying the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva, that means that you are being seen as someone with a future. In the age of 20, he became the chief rabbi of Krakow. So 20, just think about that. It's again, it's a unique age to become a chief rabbi. And in the year 1522, there is a Magefa in Krakow. And in the Magefa, he's losing his grandmother, his mother, and his wife. We have a few tshuvot from this plague, from this Magefa in Krakow, written by Rabbi Moshe Iserlish himself. One of them, extremely interesting. I didn't bring it in here. I just say it in my own words. So the question was that someone was having his apartment. I mean, he had a sublet. He had an apartment, and he had like a basement, and in the basement he was subletting it, right? He was renting it out. Now, so there was already a contract. But when the couple came to enter the basement, it was revealed that the wife was sick with the plague. Now, the owner of the home wanted to go back on the contract, to cancel the contract. He said, that is something I didn't know, I didn't foresee, and I'm not interested in the contract if that is the matter, because I'm afraid. But there was no such a qualification in the contract that if someone is sick, then you are allowed to cancel it. So they went to Rabbi Moshe Iserlish, who was the chief rabbi, to give them an advice. And Rabbi Moshe Iserlish paskened that you cannot go and cancel the contract, but he has to let the couple in. He added that according to the knowledge, the science in his time, the way that the plague would go through is not, I don't know how you say, medabek. It is not being transmitted from a person to person, but it is in the air. So they believed that the air is becoming contaminated, not because of sick person, but just the air itself is becoming contaminated. And that is why it doesn't matter if you have someone sick in your home. As long as you are living in the city, you are under threat of being poisoned by the air. And that is why you cannot cancel the contract. If you would be able to prove that the disease is transmitted directly from a sick person to the healthy one, then you would be allowed to go back, to walk back from the contract, because then it is pikuach nefesh. That was his tshuva. So he let because back then they could not scientifically prove that that is transmitted between one person to another. He let the new couple go in. So that's a very interesting tshuva that was used in these years. Nowadays, obviously, you can prove that that is transmable. What the word is? transmittable, thank you. It is transmittable between persons, and so the same tshuva was used in order to cancel contracts. Because the Rema says explicitly, if you would able to prove it, then yes, then we would go and cancel the contract. Another tshuva he says in the Gemara, it says that if there is a plague, you should leave the city, should run away. And that is again, because they believed that the air is poisoned. It is correct even if the air is not poisoned, because you should leave the city and not be. But the Rema says, and this is again quoted later by other poskim, nowadays, do not run away. Why? He says many times people bring the bad air with them. So it's very interesting. They wanted to cling to this theory of bad air, but they understood, and they said sometimes when you run away, the disease is running away with you. Right? You take with you the bad air, and it pashet. Spread, thank you. It is spread with you, and he adds, and that is increasing anti-Semitism. Because the Jews are the first one to run away. Why? Because A, the Jews were just the smartest. So they knew, it's just the facts on the ground. And B, because many times the Jews didn't own land, they didn't own fields, they would make their money through the air, like Lufthansa. And so you are able to lend money either in Krakow or in Kazimierz or in any other place. So why to stay somewhere where the air is bad? So the Jews would be the first one to run away, and then the disease would follow after, and people would blame the Jews for bringing the disease with. So the Rema says, better stay at the home. So that's very interesting, a very interesting tshuva. With a few other tshuvot, I continue. Obviously, that was a great disaster for him, as I said, a lot of his close relatives passed in the Mageifa, and he was remarried and had a few children. We don't know of any male boy, any son that survived, but we know about 3 daughters. Now, we have to understand, back then, the infancy, I think we spoke about it also a few times, that the mortality among infants was very, very high. So we speak sometimes about 40%, 60%, in numbers that nowadays we don't even want to think about. Very high numbers, because they just didn't have the conditions. They didn't have the hygienic conditions many times. And also they didn't have replacement. So if the mother for any reason could not feed the baby, then many times that would be, you would have no way to save him, just would have no way to save him. You can read also now, that some of you may, I'm sure, that some of you know it from your grandparents, that they would be children to a family, let's say, that the grandmother would give birth to 11 children, and 3, not, well, the Holocaust, and 3 would survive, 5 would survive out of 11. And that was because of infant mortality. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, the conditions are so good that if chas v'chalila there is an infant that does not survive, you get it's in the newspaper. Like they say, a mother giving birth died in the hospital. And that is that's a great disaster. But writing about in the newspaper, you understand that the reason why, according to halacha, giving birth is a pikuach nefesh, is because the mortality rate was very high to the mother and to the baby. So Rabbi Moshe Iserlish lived and led his community. As I said, he wrote many answers. He had a very interesting answer about copyright. He's one of the first, because printing was invented in his days, then he was one of the first to relate to the question of copyright. Because when you have printing, someone can print, but the luchot, the pressing sheets, they would remain in the printing house. Can the printing house work after hours to print some new editions? Let's imagine, and that is a question that was being asked. Let's imagine that someone is reprinting the Rambam with his own Perush. Beautifully placed the printing house, they print for him, he is happy, everyone is happy. Now the printing house says, fine, you have the copyright on your Perush. So we would take out the Perush from the printing boards, but we would just print plain Rambam. Now, for us, it's a saving of money because we do not have to rearrange the printing boards, right? The Rambam's all words, letters are already on the printing boards. Are they allowed to do so? That was a question he was asked. The answer was no. But just, I think, an interesting tshuva. So we continue forward. Now, in his days, the Rema, not only in his days, it was for more than 100 years, but more than 200 years, the Kabbalah was spreading. And Ashkenazic Jews were very open to Kabbalah for the simple reason that they were never open to philosophy. In Sfard, they were open to philosophy. So when Kabbalah was introduced to the masses, Kabbalah, at least according to its own tradition, Kabbalah was always there. But it was always a secret known only to individuals. When they began to spread it among the masses, so in Sfarad, it was an uphill battle. Because up till there, philosophy was very well known. So we know that in Sfarad, they produced the Kuzari, they produced other Sefarim, the Ikarim by Rabbi Yosef Elbo, Sefer HaKedah by Rabbi Yitzhak Arama, all of them important Sefarim that saw Yahadut through the lens of philosophy. So when you want to rearrange your view about what Judaism really is, you needed to fight against rooted perception of Judaism. But in Ashkenaz, they never liked philosophy. You remember, they were the ones that wanted to burn some of the Rambam books. So they didn't like philosophy. So Kabbalah was spreading very, very fast because they were waiting for something like that, which is Jewish in its smell. You see, because philosophy, even when some of our important Rishonim were trying to somehow combine philosophy with Yahadut, there is something, I'm saying my own personal position, but I think it's not only my own personal position. Always when you read even the Moreh Nevuchim, you read, there is something artificial. There is a sense of forcing one on the other. And it's just a question, which one gives more when you are doing this harakava of Judaism and philosophy. But Kabbalah feels, at least, much more, it's all psukim, it's all agadot, midrashim. It has a much more Yahadut feeling to it. Now, I'm not speaking, historically, you can argue what are the roots of Kabbalah, and that's not, it's very far, very, very far from my field of expertise. But at least the feeling it gives is much more Amish. So it was accepted much faster, and it's going very, very fast. But also in Ashkenaz, among Ashkenazic Jews, there were some Jews that read Moreh Nevuchim, that were at least a little lovers of philosophy. And one of them was the Rema. And the Rema also in his personality, it seems, he was a very peaceful man, a real student of Aaron HaKohen. And now he had a brother-in-law called the Maharshal. And we'll speak about the Maharshal in a second. Anyway, from the time of the Rambam on, there were great disputes between the lovers of philosophy and the others who believed in Torah only, and afterwards, as I said, in Kabbalah. But the Rema believed that in essence, both are saying the same thing, but in different languages. So that's a very interesting idea. You have to be merged you have to be very deep. You must have very deep knowledge of both camps in order to say, no, in truth, you're saying the same thing. So I hear you both, and you think you're arguing. But in the deepest truth of each one of you, it's completely the same. So that was what the Rema believed in. So, for example, in the Shulchan Aruch, we speak about in a few minutes in Mirza Hashem, why I'm quoting the Shulchan Aruch, who supposedly was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and I'm saying that is the opinion of the Rema. But in the Shulchan Aruch, the Rema says, A person should not learn כי מקרא, משנה וגמרא והפוסקים הנמשכים אחריהם ובזה יקנה העולם הזה והעולם הבא, אבל לא בלימוד שאר חוכמות. And he quotes that is from the Rivash and the Rashba. We spoke about both the Rivash and the Rashba, both very important Sephardic rabbis that were not fans of philosophy. So if I translate it, a person should only learn Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and Poskim, and with that you acquire both this word and the next word, but not by other wisdoms. So that seems to be very, very strict and very narrow and very clear. Next sentence, ומכל מקום מותר ללמוד באקראי בשאר החוכמות. But if you do by accident, you learn other wisdom, that's also fine. ובלבד שלא יהיו ספרי מינים, but not אפיקורסות. וזהו נקרא בין החכמים טיול בפרדס. So it's not only if you learn by accident, he says that is what we call pardes. Now we all know that pardes is a very loaded term, which means the real secrets of Torah. And that is the pardes. So the Rema says that Sh'ar Chochmot, that is a code name for philosophy, is the pardes. And you should not take a walk in the pardes unless you already filled your kriso, your stomach, with meat and wine, which is Isur and Hater and the mitzvot. And here he quotes whom? Rambam. So the Rema is able, by a majestic feat, to combine the Rivash, Rashba, and Rambam into one halacha of what you're supposed to learn. So what you're supposed to learn, only Torah, but also you should know that sometimes you can learn the philosophy, and that is the pardes. Now, the Rashba and the Rambam cannot really live together in this halacha. It's only by the force of the personality of someone like the Rema that you can join these two opinions together. And many, many mefarshim, commentators later, commenting on this psika, they pointed out that it's a contradiction. One of the most famous of them is the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, that written that this last paragraph is really the opinion of Rambam. And then the Gra says there's something which is very sharp. He says, but the Rambam was mistaken. And this is not the secrets of Torah. And the Rambam, if you would have known what are the real secrets of Torah, and obviously the Gra speaks about Kabbalah, if you would have known what are the real secrets of Torah, you would never have said it. And the Rema should not have been mistaken after the Rambam. So even after the Rema said what he said, it was still very difficult for others to take it and to continue with it. But the Rema really believed that there is no contradiction between this first sentence and the second sentence. There is no contradiction between philosophy and Torah is not only Torah, Torah is also Kabbalah. So as I said, the Maharshal was, I think he was a brother-in-law of the Rema, and he was an Ashkenazi. So he did not like philosophy at all, and he was very not pleased with his relative taking a philosophy and going with it. So he writes to the Rema, I received your letter and I saw it dvarim chidudim. He says to the Rema, I felt that you had in your letter that you wrote to me, and the Rema used philosophy, that there was something very sharp. Now, he doesn't mean he's sharp in the good sense, but he means, והרגשתי כי יזמל בבשר. I felt like someone is cutting my flesh. והקפתני בחבילות חוכמות ורובם חיצוניות. You have circled me with wisdoms, but foreign wisdoms. ובכלים שונות והפנימות הגונות. So you are completely steeped in philosophy, in external wisdoms, but what about Torah? Let's see, writes to the Rema. התורה חוגרת שק. The Torah wears sackcloth. ומקוננת עם נערותיה, כי הערות בנים ובנות הם הנזופות ומגונות, כעדה וצילה בדורות הראשונות, ולחוכמת אריסטו הערל, אליו היית פונה בכל פינות. So instead of going to the Torah, you are turning to Aristotle, who is uncircumcised. If you forgot, then he's adding that. Now the Rema answers in the following letter, לא אסרו ללמוד דברי החכמים וחקירתם במהות המציאות וטבעיהם, כי אדרבה, על ידי זה נודע גדלותו של יוצר בראשית יתברך. He says, I don't know what you want. When I learn physics, I see the greatness of God. So philosophy is Torah. והוא פירוש שיעור קומה שאמרו עליו כל היודע, ואף כי למקובלים דעת אחרת בזו, and although I know that Kabbalah is a different opinion, אלו ואלו דברי אלוקים חיים. So now that make the Marshal go completely ballistic. What do you mean? אלו ואלו, who are the אלו ואלו? The מקובלים on one hand and the philosophers on the others? These are אלו ואלו דברי אלוקים חיים? כבר אמרו במגילה, כל מי שאומר דברי חוכמה, אף באומות נקרא חכם. So he says, yeah, they are sages. Oh, they are sages. Yes. Anyone who says something who is sagic, who is a word of wisdom, he is a wise, he is a sage. So yes, אלו ואלו דברי אלוקים חיים. So you see here the width of the Rema. His ability to take things that for most of us would seem contradictions, but he sees them as complementary and as things that can not only live with each other, but enrich each other. Now, he also wrote, unfortunately, an unknown book. I mean, what do I mean unknown? It's being printed. You can buy it in the store, but no one learns it. I think it's Chaval. And it is called Torat HaOlah, in which he is marrying Kabbalah with philosophy. And he says there what I told you earlier, ואומר, כי לפי מה שנתבאר ידוע, according to what I explained, and you have to read the book to know what he explains, כי דרכי הקבלה הם עצמם דרכי הפילוסופים האמיתיים. No, that is enough. The ways of Kabbalah are really also the ways of the true philosophers. Obviously, there are philosophers who went away. There are Epicurus, right? Epicurean. He was a philosopher. So we know that there are philosophers who went off the way. But in secret, we can say that there are also some Jews, Torah Jews, that went, unfortunately, off the way. So, you know, it's here and there are dangers, but you really should hold to both. So he's not only a philosopher, he's not a rationalist, he's also a fan of Kabbalah, but he's not only a Kabbalist, he's not only a mystic, he is also Len, Rambam, and Moreh Nevuchim. He is able to marry them together in a way that, as I said, even centuries after him, after he showed the way, we find it yet very difficult. But I think it was also part of his personality, and it would play a major role in what we would see in just the next few minutes. Part of his personality was the ability to know how to merge different things. He did not need to take one flag and to run with it. He didn't see the need that there would be a central figure and all the others would disappear. He knew that in order to create an harmony, a concert, you need the first fiddle, you need the second fiddle, you need the whole, Now, we are now reaching what we really wanted to speak about. And that is obviously the commentary of the Rema on the Bet Yosef, the Tur, and that's the Rabbi Moshe, and his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. Now, what is the Tur? We already spoke about the Tur. The Tur was a book that was written by Rabbi Yaakov Rabbi Asher, the son of the Rosh. We remember the Rosh was the student of the Maram Merutenburg, and he runs away to Spain. He's not going east, he's going west. So he's going to Spain. That is in the time of the Rashba. And his son is writing a sefer called the Arba'a Turim, the 4 columns, which are basically a summary of the halachic major opinions to his time on everything that is relevant in the Galut, in the diaspora. So every halacha that is relevant, he doesn't speak about Kodshim, doesn't speak about Korbanot, but he speaks about everything that is relevant to diaspora. And he brings the majority opinion, I mean, not the majority, excuse me, the major opinions, the most important opinions. And if you remember, we spoke last week that the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, written a comment, it's not really a commentary, it's an expansion of the Tur, in which he had added all the opinions that Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Asher, the author of the Tur, thought that they are not so major, they are not so important, or didn't know them, so he didn't include them. The Bet Yosef writes down he brings down everyone in order to be able to get to the bottom line. And that is the Bet Yosef. Later on, Rabbi Yosef Karo comes on and writes the Shulchan Aruch, which is the conclusions of his Bet Yosef. So Bet Yosef is the great work, and the Shulchan Aruch are the end conclusions of what he wrote in the Bet Yosef. If you want to hear more about that, go to the recording of my shiur last week. Now, it was not only Rabbi Yosef Karo who felt the need to write an expansion to the Tur. Rabbi Moshe Iserlish, living in the same time, was a younger contemporary of the Bet Yosef, of Yosef Karo, living hundreds of miles away. So Rabbi Yosef Karo lives, again, he was born maybe in Spain or in Portugal, and he's going through, Turkey, and he's ending up in Eretz Israel in Tzfat. And in the same time, Rabbi Yosef Karo Rabbi Moshe Iserlish lives in Krakow in Poland. So that's very far away. But both has the same idea. That is, that the Tur needs to be expanded. And while Rabbi Yosef Karo begins his project, also Rabbi Moshe Iserlish begins. But we do not have what he wrote. And the reason to that is explained in his introduction to his commentary on the Bet Yosef. So again, he wrote something that is parallel, equivalent to the Bet Yosef. But what we have is notes on the Bet Yosef and on the Tur. How that came to be. That is explained in the introduction to the Darchei Moshe on the Tur. Let's read it. אמרו לי רעיוני, וחזיון דבר חוכמה לנגד עיניי. So I was told I had an idea, I had a word of wisdom. ללכות כל חידושי הפוסקים ביחד, כדי שיהיו בידי כאחד. So I wanted to write all of the words of the poskim together, so I would have all of them in front of my eyes, ולכותבן לזיכרון בצד איזה פוסק אחד, וראיתי שאין טוב מזה לספר הטורים, כי דבריהם בסדר נאה מסודרים, ובקל אפשר למצוא בו מבוקש או אף אחד מן המבוארים. So he says, I saw it would be the simplest way to write it next to the Tur. Why? Because the Tur is a very simple book, even a simple tone, מבוארים, can use it, and that's why I thought it would be the easiest to add all the other opinions to the words of the Tur. We can see that it's exactly the same idea that was done by Rabbi Yosef Karo. ועל ידי זה יהיו הדברים בליבי, צפונים ושמורים, ומיד את מותניי עזרתי, so that's, I immediately took myself, ומשנת תרדמתי ננערתי, I woke up from my sleep, ומעזר יושב תהילות נעזרתי, and I was being helped by God, שמחשבותיי התחלתי וכמעט גמד, so I began, I almost finished, he said. I almost finished my work, וכל חידושי הפוסקים והתשובות ביחד חיברתי. I created, I authored a whole compendium of the words of the poskim. וסדר בעל הטורים בהם סידרתי, ולא שלותי ולא שקטתי, I didn't have rest, I didn't have peace, ואם ישנתי אז ינוח לי, וזה החלקי בכל ימי עמלי. So I thought that would be my heritage, that would remain after me, this great work. ובעזר העוזר האמיתית של הדין. עשיתי הדבר בלי שהות, לכתוב כל החידושים בצד הטור להגאות, so I wrote everything next to the Tur, ובהגיע תור אסתר, so that is a play of words on the Megillah, but when the column of Esther, it means Isur ve'Heter, came, and I began to write הלכות חלה, אחזני פלצות ולבשני חלחלה, then something horrific came to me, I was horrified. בשומעי נר ישראל ראש הגולה, ערים מסובכו עלה, אל השמיים ורוח אלוהים קדישין בחופנו אסף, וחיבר ספר בית יוסף. I heard that the head of all the Jews, the great rabbi of the generation, Rabbi Yosef Karo, wrote his Beit Yosef. אשר כל רואיו ידעון את מעלתו ואת טובו ורוב טוב הצפון בקרבו. Everyone who saw it knew how good it is. אז נבהלתי שפועל הריק פעלתי. Then I thought my work was for vain. And who knows how many years he worked on this. I mean, we know that the Bet Yosef worked, Rabbi Yosef worked for 22 years. There is no reason to think that for the Ramah it took much less. So that is work of decades. יגעתי לריק ולבעלה, שנתי בחינה ממני גזלתי, ולניעור הזה התפללתי. That is what I was praying for. כי דבריי נגד החכם הנ"ל כעין נחשבו. I feel that my words against Rabbi Yosef Karo, they are not, like nothing. בשיר גבתי, what my candle would help in sunlight. וכפיס מעץ כמוני מה יענה, כי בידיעתו הכוללת הקיף את הכל, והשם ברך אותו בכל, דבר אחד ממנו לא נפל מכל. So he has everything in there. What can I add? ובהיותי ימים רבים בזאת המבוכה, אשר לא היה לליבי מנוחה כהלכה, נמס בקרבי כמו מים. So my heart was failing and I didn't know what to do. Now we can imagine. It is his life work. It is his life work. What would you, if he would come to you to an advice, what would you say? I know what I would have said. I would have said, okay, Rabbi Yosef Karo would print his book. You should print your book. You are in Ashkenaz. It would take a long time before the books of the Rabbi Yosef Karo would come in, and you are well known. Maybe they know his name, but no one really knows him. They know you. You are the chief rabbi of all Poland. You are the most important rabbi of Ashkenaz, of Ashkenazic Jews. You would have good sellings, and we'll see, the better would win. Let's give the market do his work. I think that's what I would have said. It's not what the Ramah is doing. So he says, I pray to God. התפללתי אל אבי שבשמיים לאמור הברכה אחתי לך אבי. Is there only one blessing? Is there only one? That is what Asaph said, right? Is there only one bracha that can be given? ותן לי דרך אמת בלבבי, שלא יהיו כל דבריי גנוזים ותוך הבאים יהיו רמוזים, ואז חמתי שכחה. So then I came down. ואמרתי אבינה דברי ספר בית יוסף ואחריתו, כי אמר לי אלוקים אל תירא אותו ואת ביתו. I said I shouldn't fear. ואף כי לא הניח לך מקום להתגדר. מכל מקום לפני מלכים ושרים במלאכתך תתהדר. He says, we would not go through everything he says here because it's too long if you want you to read it inside. But basically what he says is, I understood that it would make more sense to join than to fight. I don't want to compete. Because I understood that in essence, we are saying the same things, only in different language. So you see this continuing line in his personality. And he says, I understood what he did is excellent for Sfaradim, but we have many other different minhagim. And we, not only that we have different bottom lines, we have, different calculus, we have different ways to reach, different methods, how to reach halachic bottom line. Because according to Bet Yosef, in order to reach halacha, you should go as early as you can. So go to the first Rishonim, go to the Geonim, go to Rambam, Rif, and Rosh. But the Ashkenazim never did that way. The way that Ashkenazic halacha always was check what is the minhag in the last 100 years, and that it should be halacha. So it's a he says, now both of us are aiming to the same goal, and that is to create a compendium of all halachic opinions, but we are speaking different languages. So instead of competing, we can join forces. So I would just comment on the Bet Yosef. And what he did was, he took his great work, and anyone who wrote something in his life and needed to edit it knows how painful is the process that I'm now going to describe. What he did was to cut away most of what he wrote, all of the pilpulim, all of the arguments for and against, and only retain the last lines. and what he thought was maybe a comment that did not appear in the Bet Yosef, and it is important for him to appear. And instead of the whole book printed out as standing to itself, as a standalone, he printed only the bottom lines and what he thought was new comments on the Bet Yosef. Now it happened not only once, but amazingly, it happened twice. Because after the Rema has published his Bet Yosef and the Rema published his notes on the Bet Yosef, then the Rema said, you know what, so I would write a new book with only the halachic outcomes. But you know what? Rabbi Yosef Karo thought the same thing. So it happened again. This time it seems that the Rema was not really very long into the project, so it was not as painful. But again, Rabbi Yosef Karo is able to come before Rabbi Moshe Iserlish, and the Shulchan Aruch is being published. And again, the Rema does the same. Instead of writing a different Ashkenazic Shulchan Aruch, he decides that he would add his tablecloth, the mapa. He would add a tablecloth on the table. So the Shulchan Aruch is a set table, and then the Rema adds his mapa, his tablecloth. And what he really did was to make the Shulchan Aruch into a co-ed project, which the Rabbi Yosef Karo did not necessarily meant it to be. But from the minute the Rema wrote his notes, there was almost no edition of the Shulchan Aruch, either printed in the Sephardic diaspora or in the Ashkenazic diaspora, that did not have both the Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Rema. So just an example. This is the first siman of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Rabbi Yosef Karo says, "Itgaber ke'ari la'amot baboker la'avodat bor'o, sheyeh hu me'orer hashachar." So a person needs to wake up even before the sun. You should wake up the sun, not the sun wake up you, because we should stand up to service God. That is the first halacha in Shulchan Aruch. Now the Rema, realist as ever, על כל פנים, anyway, לא יאחר זמן התפילה שהציבור מתפללים. Do not wake up after תפילה. Shulchan Aruch, right? You should wake up early and wake early before the sun even rises. Says the Rema, yeah, at least do not be late after Zman Kriyat Shema. So that is just an interesting difference in, I guess, in lifestyle. Also, we have to remember, Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in Tzefat in a very high tension spiritual stance. Rabbi Moshe Iserlish lives in Krakow among more ordinary Jews. So I guess that is part of the difference you see here. But then he has a very long, I don't want to read it now, but a very long edition. So that is how you see that we have here the Shulchan Aruch, we have the Rema, it's the same book. Now it is agreed upon almost everyone, both Rabbanim and Chokrim, researchers, that if Rabbi Yosef Karo would only write his book and the Rema would write a separate book, it may well be that 500 years later, we would not remember not this book and neither the other. Both would disappear because there would be very specific books for specific audience. But because the Rema decided to write with Rabbi Yosef Karo, both his Darchei Moshe on the Bet Yosef and his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the glosses, as it's called, on the Shulchan Aruch, that is why the Shulchan Aruch became the Shulchan Aruch, not only Rabbi Yosef Karo, not only Rabbi Moshe Iserlish, but as a co-work of both the greatest Sephardic posek of the generation and the greatest Ashkenazic posek of the generation, cooperating without ever seeing each other. They had some short exchange of letters, but they didn't write it together because they exchanged letters. They wrote it together because of the decision of the Rema to give up fame, to give up having his own sefer, and cooperating. And as I said, anyone who wrote knows the pain of, even when you know that what you wrote should be edited out, then it is very difficult to edit something out because it's not like, but it is like something you have given birth to. And having to cutting it out is cutting out a member of yourself. and cutting the majority of what you wrote out and not even writing a book, but only having it as glosses on something someone else's work, that is, I don't know, it's almost superhuman. Someone worked 15 years on a work, and then he has to not compromise, compress it, thank you. Compress it to some sentences. How can you do that? But he knew that is the best way to act, because that's just the right thing to do. And that is what gave eternal life to both works of the Bet Yosef and the Rema, and that is what in the end closed the era of the Rishonim we were speaking about. Because after they wrote what became the official halacha books, I mean, to this day, as I said last week, we spoke about the Shulchan Aruch Jew. Now, no one speaks about the Rema Jew, but we know that the Shulchan Aruch is composed of these two great giants. And after that, anyone that would write after that cannot write without looking at the Bet Yosef, without looking at the Rabbi Moshe, without looking at the Rema and the Shulchan Aruch. So from there on, they would all be achronim, later to the Shulchan Aruch. The Rema himself was niftar in Lag BaOmer of Shin Lamed Gimel, and he was only 42. There is some misconception that he was niftar in Lag BaOmer 32, and he was 32, and he wrote 32 Sefarim. It's a nice legend. It is incorrect. We have the dates. We know the truth, and he was not a niftar when he was 30. He was niftar when he was 42. Excuse me, 43, but he was 42. So it's Shin Lamed Gimel, and it is Lag BaOmer, but he was 42. And he was buried in the Krakow cemetery. We have we know where it is. Now, above his kever, above his grave, there is a giant tree. Now, usually in Jewish cemeteries, we do not want trees growing in the cemetery, but in this matter, there was. Now, there is a beautiful story behind it. They say that the Rema buried the work that he wrote, his own commentary on the Torah. He buried it under the tree. And when he was niftar, in his will, he asked to be buried next to this hidden work. And that is why he's buried under a tree. Now that is a legend, but it's a beautiful legend, so why not? So he's buried under this tree. And it's very interesting that every Lag BaOmer, up to the Second World War, we have pictures. There would be thousands of Jews also coming to Miron, but in Poland. Thousands of Jews coming from all over Eastern Europe. They would come to Krakow to learn Torah of the Rema on his yahrzeit. And we have pictures. The whole of Krakow would be filled with Jews coming to learn the Torah of the Rema, which I think is a beautiful story. And with that, we conclude our series on the Rishonim. Im Yirtzeh Hashem, in the next coming weeks, days, I would send for you to vote on the topic for the summer. So if anyone wants to give ideas, then you are invited to send me a message or to speak with me. And as I said, in a few days, I would gather either your suggestions or my own thoughts, and I would send you to vote. Thank you so much for participating, and I'm already looking forward to our meeting after Pesach.